If you're ever curious why most financial advisors don't sound like Sarah and I typically do on this show, well, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels. And today we are in part two of the show about yours truly's new book, The Retirement Income Source. But if you weren't here last week, don't worry. You can still get a lot out of part two, because we're going to start by summarizing what we talked about last week and then building on it through this week's show.
That's right, Dave. It's great to be here with you and, of course, with all of our loyal listeners as we go through part two of your book, really, and talk about the most important topics that our listeners need to know. Dave's latest book, it's The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income, and you can get your copy on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. But last week, Dave, we covered really the psychological aspect when it comes to retiring and why people struggle to go from that mindset of total return to the income first mindset. We also talked about the idea of purpose versus performance, max return, minimum risk, but for what purpose exactly, and how most of our listeners, the purpose for their money is really to generate income in retirement. Most people, the primary goal. That's right.
And everyone wants maximum return with minimum risk, but they often don't say for what purpose. They look at their money as a pool of money. And there's these pool of funds that somehow is magically going to turn into an income stream. And in their defense, you go to work, you're age, 20, 25, and you work for 30 years, and you're not really worried about it because you're just trying to grow your nest egg.
Right. You have that paycheck coming in every 2 weeks as well.
But you get to the mid-50s, and you have to start thinking about, wait a minute, what is the purpose here? Is this for just to leave a huge legacy? I'm never, ever going to touch it? Doubtful, right, with most of our listeners.
Most people might want that for some of their money, but that's not usually the primary goal.
That's right. Or am I going to cash it all out in a lump sum, buy something really expensive? Again, most people know.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Or is the purpose of this money here to get maximum return for income? And, so far we talked last week, Sarah, a lot about the way not to generate income, and that's through the withdrawal method.
Right. This idea that you can take 4% or so per year, annually withdrawing it, like you mentioned, Dave, withdrawing it, selling those shares to make that money, that is not the right way to generate income.
That's spending principal. And remember, it may be considered taxable income, but there's three definitions of income. One is the IRS's definition of income. They don't care whether it comes out of principal or interest. It's taxable income. And the second one is cash flow, which you could be getting, but that's not necessarily coming off income. That could be coming out of selling principal. And the third is actual income, actual interest and dividends, which is what we talk about week in and week out right here on the show.
Right. Interest and dividends. That's the right way to actually generate income. Let's get to our first Ask Dave question. We have a question from Carl in Tennessee. He says, last week I was listening to the show, and thank you, Carl. We appreciate you listening to the show. He said, last week I heard you mention bond mutual funds. I know about bonds. I know about mutual funds, but can you explain these bond mutual funds?
Sure, Carl. And, bonds have two important guarantees that are usually attractive to a retiree. Number one, they pay a guaranteed interest payment for the life of the bond. And secondarily, they guarantee they're going to pay back the full face amount, that is the principal essentially, when that bond matures. There's a maturity date. Again, two important guarantees that attract retirees to bonds. The problem is when you buy a bond fund, neither of those guarantees exist, right? The interest payments can and do fluctuate, number one. And number two, there's no fixed maturity date at which the bond fund guarantees that's going to pay back all your principal, which means that bond funds have more risk than a diversified portfolio of individual bonds. Why? Because, again, those two guarantees are gone. And by the way, Carl, how you might know this just as a layperson is if you were to Google the definition of a bond mutual fund, if it's the Securities and Exchange definition, what would pop up is a bond mutual fund, Carl, is the stock of a company that owns bonds. So instead of having a bond, instead of having a contract with an issuer, you actually have a bond mutual fund. You have the stock of a company that owns bonds. At least if you own the contract, you're guaranteed by the issuer against loss. Now, that doesn't mean the issuer can't go belly up or default, sure, but they have to default in order to to really not pay you that fixed rate of interest and that principal. So that's why bond funds exist in 401ks, Carl, because they're there for younger workers who want a little bit of diversification, but they're not an ideal tool for people who are retirees who are looking to have a fixed interest payment.
Carl, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a question, maybe something you heard on one of our recent shows and you would like Dave to clarify, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com, and you might hear your question answered on a future show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today's episode is part 2, talking about all of the important topics within Dave's latest book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. And Dave, we're calling this show really Why Your Financial Advisor Probably Doesn't Sound Like Dave Scranton, unless you're working with David Scranton, of course. But I think this really goes back to, Dave, people getting confused between all of these terms even, because the advisors really interchange them. Like total return can equal growth, it can equal income. People think, oh, I'm generating income when I'm selling my shares because I'm being taxed on it as income, when that is not.
The IRS calls it taxable
right,
income.
the IRS thinks it's income, right? They want their share.
And your firm sends you a 1099. The reality is that, you want to do no damage first, and that's where bonds come in, because bonds can assure you get a fixed rate of income. I call bonds and bond-like instruments. And now, to the defense of most advisors will say you have to be careful with bonds because you need an inflation hedge. And that's true, and bonds generally don't give you a great inflation hedge unless you do like one of our callers last week, where you reinvest part of the interest and take part of the interest, right?
Right. Well, that's the best way to create an inflation hedge, right? Is
Sure, but not just bonds, through other things too.
Through other things,
so bonds are not a great inflation hedge, granted, but what's an even worse inflation hedge is using the withdrawal method and selling shares, so you have fewer and fewer shares left, this year than the previous year. And that's what happens a lot of times when you're in bond mutual funds. But in the spirit of today's show, why don't advisors utilize bonds and bond-like instruments that much? Why?
Right. Why aren't they investing in those, or why aren't they putting their clients' money in those investments that will generate income the right way?
And they might say it's because, well, we don't think you should have a lot of money in bonds. You need an inflation hedge. And they're right. People are living longer. You do need an inflation hedge. But they'll put them in bond funds, which are even worse, which is the funny part.
So it kind of ruins that argument a little
The
bit.
reason is because of the expertise it takes with individual bonds. To buy bonds, you're more of like a mortgage analyst. To buy stocks, it's a whole different thing. So it's kind of like an offensive coordinator versus defensive coordinator, right? Defensive coordinators typically don't make good offensive coordinators, and offensive coordinators don't make good defensive coordinators. So to be a good bond person, you need to have that defensive mindset. And most advisors aren't trained in that mindset. Moreover, you got to have technology. You have to invest money in technology in order to be able to buy these things. You can't just buy them like you can a stock or bond by pushing a button on a computer. Bonds are done in negotiated market. It's like buying real estate. So when you're negotiating to buy a house, it's the same thing when you're buying a bond. So it takes more knowledge of the markets. It takes more time to make those purchases. And frankly, more time to do the research, because now you have to research individual holdings, which is in a fund or an ETF, you don't have to. So lots of reasons why most advisors don't have the knowledge bandwidth, the time bandwidth, or the money to pay for the technology that they desperately need if they're going to be a good income specialist. Coming up, Sarah, we're going to talk more about the bond and bond-like instrument side, but also the stock side, and share with you some things that you may not know. And last week, I challenged financial advisors to join us here on this week's show. And if you're here, financial advisors, welcome, as you're going to start learning in the next segment some things that you may not even know about the stock market, in spite of being in the financial industry for a good number of years. Stay tuned. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you've been listening to our show for a little while, you might be saying to yourself, hey, David sounds a lot different than the things that I've heard. He says a lot of different things from what I've heard from my advisor and from other financial advisors out there. So today we're breaking it all down to why your financial advisor may not be saying the same things as Dave. And we've talked so far a little bit about why financial advisors in general, why they invest in bond mutual funds or put their money in those investments, and how to be a true income specialist and to invest in bonds the right way. It really takes knowledge, experience, time, and really having the right equipment as well.
Well, first of all, we learned, during the financial crisis, the movie The Big Short, right?
Yes.
Why we can't trust the rating agencies. The rating agencies, are if they're going to give you a C rating on a bond, you're probably not going to want that rating agency to review your bonds, right?
Right, yeah.
So there's a little bit of a bias there. So first of all, a true bond specialist in bonds or bond-like instruments needs to look beyond the rating. So it's not as easy as a lot of stock specialists think. You have to look at the financials. So you have to get into the income statement. You have to get into the cash flow statement. You have to get into the balance sheet. And you really have to decide, okay, is this a good risk? I mean, there are times when you might get somebody who's got a FICO score of 750 versus somebody with a FICO score of 650. But if you're a good mortgage analyst, you may say, well, that person who's a 650 is a better credit risk. The reason they're at a 650 is because when they're getting divorced, despite them, that person's ex-spouse didn't pay all the credit card bills, right?
There was something in the past.
There's a legitimate reason why that wasn't them, but when you look at the credit, they're a better credit risk than the one with a FICO score of 750. And the same is true in bonds and bond-like instruments. So first of all, you got to roll up your sleeves and do a lot of work as a credit analyst. Then you've got to stay away from bond funds and bond ETFs. You got to focus more on individual bonds or individual preferreds, right? Bond-like instruments, right? Then you go to buy these things. And once again, they're negotiated. They're at auction. They're not purchased like a stock where, you push a button and boom, it's going to get executed pretty much at the same price that the last person paid for it, right? It's auction. So you have to go and negotiate it. And it's a bid and ask spread between what they're trying to get and what you're trying to buy it for, just like a piece of real estate, right? Yeah. The seller has in their mind what they think they're going to sell it for. You have in your mind what you're willing to pay for it. You have to negotiate and meet in the middle. And that's how bonds are purchased. So again, it takes a lot of knowledge, takes a lot of time for an advisor to do this, which is why I invited so many advisors on this show. And I hope we get some people on the show today that are financial advisors that are listening, because I think they can learn a lot too about this. And frankly, how to be better income investors, because it's really not the niche for most advisors today.
Well, I remember, Dave, last week you encouraged financial advisors out there to actually listen to our show this week. So we went through some of our responses, and we got a lot of financial advisors that responded. So
good.
I want to get to one of those questions, actually. We have
this could be a first right here on our show. Financial advisor of the question. I love it. Yeah,
absolutely. Maybe we had financial advisors on the show in the past. Maybe they just didn't reveal themselves right in the questions. But this question actually comes from Derek. He is out of Tennessee. He says, Dave, you're right. I'm a financial advisor. I don't integrate bonds in my practice, but I do use high dividend stocks, and we do this through ETF. So what's your take on this approach?
All right, first of all, I don't believe his real name is Derek. I'm sure he has clients that are listening. So
maybe he's got a fake name.
So
here.
Derek, I'll call you Derek, but that's all right. I call Sarah too, and that's not her real name. So that's right. Yeah, that's right. It's all artificial on the radio here. So Derek, what's the difference? You're probably asking, okay, is that okay using high dividend strategies? Well, okay, so first of all, let me break it down. High dividend stock strategies are one way to get income. And yes, healthy companies over time will like to increase the dividends, not decrease them. But in the times of financial turmoil, remember, Derek, that companies do cut dividends. So when you're in a high dividend ETF or just like a high dividend stock fund, those dividends can get cut during times of crisis. So that's the first problem, is that you don't want to rely only on that. You want to have some bonds and bond-like instruments to have some, fixed income. That's why they're called fixed income investments, right? But there's a second problem, and the second problem is that frankly, most managers that manage exchange traded funds or manage stock funds are really closet indexers. Now, I know you know, Derek, what I mean by that, but for our listeners, a closet indexer is a fund manager that tries to basically match or kind of copy an index like the S&P 500. And you might think, well, why do they do that? Well, they do it because they don't want to underperform. They know that if they outperform, great, they might get a little bit of money, extra money into their fund. They might get a little bigger bonus. But they know that if they outperform, that money's going to flow out of the fund, especially if they outperform for 2 years or more. Money's going to flow out of the fund. And frankly, not only will they not get a bonus, but that fund manager might actually lose his or her job. So most people are closet indexers who manage stock mutual funds or ETFs. So Derek, what does that mean? That means that you're going to be hard-pressed to find a fund that has a 4 or 5% dividend yield. It's probably less. You're probably getting 2.5, maybe 3. Why? Because they know if they deviate too far from the S&P 500, for example, and Derek, you know that the current yield on the S&P right now is about 1.3%, that there's years they're going to outperform, but yeah, there's going to be years where they underperform, and that's what they're more worried about. So Derek, the only way to really successfully invest in high dividend strategies, I believe, is to be willing to go out there and do individual securities and do it on your own, because I've been hard pressed to find ETFs or mutual funds that aren't closet indexers. So Derek, stay with us a bit longer. We're going to be talking about this more right here on the show.
Yep. And Derek, thank you so much for listening to the show and, of course, for sending in your response to Dave's call last week for our financial advisors to write in and talk about if they integrate bonds into their practice. And if you're a listener, you're a regular listener, maybe you have a question about your retirement strategy, maybe you're a financial advisor who's looking for more information. Well, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com to ask your question, and you may hear it answered on a future show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. Today we're talking about why your financial advisor, he or she might not sound like David Scranton. Of course, they're probably not a best-selling author multiple times over like our David Scranton, who's recently published a book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. But one of the big reasons why most advisors don't sound like Dave or sound like income specialists is that they're focusing on some of the bigger picture things, some of the things that they can invest in that really might be most beneficial for them, even really, Dave. You know, that they're worried about the index in particular, that if they stray too far from an S&P index.
And just to be clear, you're not talking about Derek as a financial advisor.
No.
You're talking about the people that manage the ETFs that maybe Derek has chosen.
That's exactly who I'm talking about. Yes, those people that, you know, it's difficult, I think, for people our listeners even to realize that it's, you know, there's a lot of different specialties inside of it.
Yeah, if you're going to try to get a dividend yield that's 3 or 4 times that of the S&P 500, there's years you're going to outperform it, there's years you're going to underperform it. And you might get a little extra kudos in the years you outperform it, but guess what? In the years you underperform, you're probably going to you're not going to get any Wall Street bonuses, and you're probably going to lose your job, which is why, like I said to Derek, the best way I believe is to, really work with individual stocks if you want to create a high dividend portfolio. But, you know, the difficulty, and we won't have time to get through this, you know, in this segment, but I want to talk about it more even after the segment. The reality is that, you know, investing in high dividend stocks is harder than growth stocks. And Derek, if you're still listening, you know, you might think, like many financial advisors, that growth stocks are more difficult than dividend stocks because you think, you know, gosh, they're riskier, they could be more volatile, and all those things are true. But they're not more difficult to buy, because here's where most advisors, Sarah, this is how they do their stock analysis. First of all, they look at the financials, right? Income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement. Then they look at maybe some charts, and does the stock have momentum or not? And based upon what share they have of the industry and the direction they're going in, they make a decision, do they buy or do they sell, right? And if they buy, they might buy, and then they might just put in certain prices where, gosh, if it falls below a certain price, they want to sell. Well, as I want to talk about coming up, if you're an income-first investor in the stock market, Derek, if you're an income-first, growth-second investor, then where that person's research begins is where everyone else's leaves off. Yeah, you've got to do the charts. Yes, you've got to look at the financials, but then you've got to do a lot more.
Yep, there's a lot more that goes into it, especially when you're looking at those high dividend stocks as opposed to just the growth stock. So we're going to talk about that more coming up. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we have been talking about why financial advisors out there, they might be telling you some different things than David Scranton tells you every week on this show. We've talked a little bit about the difference really with bonds and bond mutual funds and why people interchange the two and how they're very different. We've also talked about bonds and bond-like instruments and why it can be more difficult for advisors to invest in these and why they really need a higher level of understanding, really to be specialists in these types of investments. But overall, Dave, you mentioned, we had a question actually from Derek in Tennessee, a financial advisor. Thank you again, Derek, for writing in.
Thank you.
He mentioned he doesn't integrate bonds, but he does use high dividend stocks. He does it through ETFs.
Yes.
And you mentioned that there's some issues with ETFs, and the best way really to invest for income in the stock market is through individual securities.
Yeah, and this is where, Derek, you're lukewarm. You're lukewarm, heading in the right direction because people are living longer and longer, right? We mentioned how you need an inflation hedge as people live longer, and healthcare costs go up at almost double the rate of inflation is the regular rate, so you really need an inflation hedge for that. And you don't want to cannibalize your principal if you want to leave a good legacy, right? We also talked about how bonds are good income instruments, but the only way to turn a bond into an inflation hedge is to not spend all the interest, to reinvest some, right?
That, yeah.
So stocks have potentially an inflation hedge because healthy companies over time increase their dividends. So that's an inflation hedge. And the stock itself, hopefully healthy companies, goes up in value over the very, very long run. So yeah, those are the good things. But again, ETFs are a problem because they don't really pay, generally speaking, dividends that are that high. Most stock ETFs, if you're getting 3% out of them, you're doing well, when you could be getting 4 or 5 in a real stock-based high dividend strategy. So why are they so much better? Why are they so hard to do? Well, we mentioned before the break that, hey, even if you are in if you're looking at stocks as a growth specialist, you're looking at the financials of the company, you're looking at the charts, you're looking at, hey, where is it that we think this company's going in terms of market share in their industry, and we decide whether to buy it or whether to sell it. Well, the problem is with a high dividend stock investor, usually their research starts where that research ends. So it's much more extensive. Again, takes more technical expertise and takes more bandwidth in terms of time. Because when you're talking about a high dividend stock, you're talking about more of a value-based company than a growth-based company. Value-based companies on paper are out of favor right now. The price has been pushed down for some reason.
Growth is the darling right now, right? The tech stocks.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. But if the price is pushed down, that's why the dividend is currently high. But you want to make sure that it's not down for a reason. You want to make sure the price is temporarily down and could bounce back and give you some growth. So you have to dig a lot deeper than just ride the momentum of these growth darlings, right?
Right.
And in diving deeper, you've got to look at all the reasons why something might be out of favor right now and do a pretty deep analysis to determine, hey, do I think this is out of favor permanently, or do I think that this is not? So it becomes more of a subjective research than just a mathematical financial research like most analysts would embark upon.
Absolutely. Well, Dave, I mentioned a few minutes ago about how we had a financial advisor, Derek, right in last segment, and we handpicked some of these responses that we got from advisors. We actually have another advisor for you because I know you really wanted to,
all right, that's cool.
to talk to some financial advisors out there. So this is from Cameron in North Carolina. He says, I've heard you mention predictable, repeatable cycles before. So wouldn't that make growth investing easier over time?
All right, Cameron, gosh, you may have read one of my books going back more than a decade where I talk about the secular stock market cycles. And Cameron, you're right, historically, things were very predictable and repeatable, so it seemed over the long run. In history, we've had, going back to the 1800s, we've had 15 to 20-year bear market cycles where the market was underwater for 15 to 20 years, just like it was underwater from 2000 to 2013, which was only a 13-year period. And then the markets did really well for maybe 10, 12, maybe even 15 years. And that these alternated in what historically seemed to be a predictable, repeatable fashion. But Cameron, that has changed a lot, and it's changed for several reasons. Number one, the record amount of, let's categorize it, Cameron. It's things that essentially manipulate the markets. Okay, so what are some of these things? Well, first of all, there's corporate buybacks. Companies are using a lot of the money now to buy back shares, whether it's profits or whether it's issuing money, issuing bonds and borrowing money to buy back shares, because in doing so, they create an artificial demand for their stocks. They drive up the price. But corporate buybacks aren't the biggest. Perhaps the biggest thing is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's unprecedented involvement in the markets by driving down interest rates. In fact, that's why I think the 2000 to 2013 period where the market was underwater was a shorter time period than is on record before for a secular bear market. Why? Because the Fed they lowered interest rates to zero for the first time ever in 2008 in response to the financial crisis, and they injected financial steroids, if you will, into the market. And by doing so, they caused that bear market to recover more quickly, and they caused a bull market then in the teens, the 20 teens. And again, the Fed did it again when the pandemic hit by jamming interest rates back down, record lows, and again, continuing to control the markets. You could argue even now they've kind of controlled inflation, not completely, but they're lowering interest rates again. So with the unprecedented manipulation, I would give less credit than I have in the past to the predictability and repeatability of these particular stock market cycles. But Cameron, thanks for reading one of my previous books, as I assume you have.
Yep. Cameron, thank you for sending in your Ask Dave question. If any of our listeners have a question, maybe you read one of Dave's books or you read one of Dave's latest book and you have a question about something in there, please send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, you've probably heard some things from Dave. Maybe it's your first time hearing them. Maybe it's the opposite even of what you've heard from your own financial advisor out there. So today we're talking about why David sounds so different from the average financial advisor out there. And really, Dave, it's because you're a specialist. You started out your career in the 90s as a financial advisor. It's
the
really
80s.
with the 80s.
Yeah.
Sorry, the 80s actually, right?
Yeah. I'm older than dirt.
You started out in the 80s and you made that transition in your own career really to go from being a financial advisor to really being that income focused, to working with retirees.
And it made my life a lot harder because I had to learn the bond and bond-like instrument side, which we talked about earlier in the show, and why that's a challenge. And then, as we just talked about with Cameron and Derek too, we had to talk. I had to do more with individual stocks, and it is different because if you believe these market cycles are predictable and repeatable, as I had witnessed in the past earlier on in my career, well, then you can use exchange traded funds and just be more in the markets when you're in a secular bull market period, and then be in bonds and bond-like instruments when you're in a secular bear market, and just switch back and forth. And that can work if you believe those periods are as predictable and repeatable as in the past. But now you have all these artificial forces controlling them, like the corporate buybacks, like the Federal Reserve, and others that we don't even have time to mention on the show, which is why I believe the only way to really confidently be in the market today for retirees is to be really an individual stock picker, not try to ride the market overall. If you know the market's going up, you can ride the market. If you know it's going down, you know to stay out of it. But if you're not sure, then you want to pick undervalued companies. And again, that's where a good value-based stock picker, Sarah, will look at the financials, the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, look at the charts and the trends. But then they're going to look and say, okay, half the world thinks that this stock is out of favor, that it's going to keep going down, and that's why it's down in value. That's why the dividend is high temporarily. The other half of the world thinks, okay, it might do okay. So you got to figure out which half you're on. Is this down for a reason and it should be down, or is this down temporarily and should bounce back? Yeah. So the extra analysis that this stock picker needs to utilize to be a good high dividend value-based stock picker is you have to be more subjective than just objective. You need to go and interview people, ideally analysts that you know in the industry, and get their opinions. Why does one think that this is down temporarily? The other one thinks it's down permanently. Then make a list of questions. Then you have to go to shareholder services and call the company and ask these questions and find out, get answers and find out what you think. And maybe you have to do another iteration, go back to these analysts you know throughout the industry. And again, give them the answers and create more questions. And only once you're satisfied with the answers you get that this is down temporarily, not permanently, it's a good value play, that it's down in value, pays a high dividend, but could go up, that is when you consider buying it as a high dividend, value-based stock selector.
Yep, and that's why high dividend value stocks can be a lot more difficult to invest in, to know everything you need to know to make the right choices. So we'll continue talking about some things you may have heard from your financial advisors and why it is totally different when you have an income first approach, when you're focusing on that income and how you can change your mindset. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and we are now finishing up part 2 of the show about the newest book from yours truly, entitled The Retirement Income Source, just like the namesake of the show. And Sarah, so far we've talked about why investing for income is something you don't hear from a lot of financial advisors, why most financial advisors sound different from us here on the show. But also why it's more difficult. We delved into the universe of bonds and bond-like instruments, how it's more difficult to utilize bonds and bond-like instruments on an individual basis if you're a financial advisor compared to putting a client in a bond fund or a bond ETF. And then we also talked about why high dividend stock funds or stock ETFs may not be the best choice for a high dividend stock strategy, especially with the markets being more manipulated now by the Federal Reserve and other sources, and frankly, being even less predictable than they've ever been in the past.
Yeah. And last week, Dave, we made a call out to all of our financial advisor listeners that are listening to the show to write in, and we actually got great response from a lot of these advisors. We've answered a few of the questions, and this really tells me that advisors out there, financial advisors, at least the ones listening to our show, they really want to do the right thing when it comes to investing for income. So really my question is, why aren't they? Why aren't they making the moves to invest for income the right way?
And there's lots of different reasons. And, there's a few bad apples, just like in any field. There's a few bad apples. You hear about lawyers going to jail. You hear about doctors getting in trouble, of course. But most financial advisors are well-intended. So I think it falls into a few categories. I mean, first of all, most financial advisors get into business, in their 20s or 30s, and as a result, it's known in the industry, Sarah, that we tend to work with people early on that are within 10 years of our age group, right? So it means you're working with people maybe in their 30s, and then 10 years later they're in their 40s, and 10 years later they're in their early 50s, and up until that point, a total return strategy, regardless of where it comes from, is fine, right? But then your clients finally get toward their late 50s, where obviously it's not so fine, but that's all you know. That's all you've learned. That's all you've become used to. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is just what Wall Street teaches. Unfortunately, a lot of us have gotten bad information. I share a story about how I went for several credentials, in the financial industry. And even when I saw in the front page of the Wall Street Journal that certain strategies were failing, I was being taught to still study those. And even though we've learned since then that those given strategies have permanently failed, those schools that teach financial advisors are still teaching those same strategies, even though we know they just don't work anymore. So a lot of it is just bad education in the financial field and a lot of biases. So if it's not the greed of a financial advisor, because financial advisors are trying to do the right thing, most of them are, then it's the greed of the companies, right? Because most companies, their fiduciary responsibility isn't to their clients or their advisors, it's to their shareholders. They want to maximize their company's profit. And in order to do that, you've got to sell the things that have the highest profit margins.
Yeah, and you could be locked into having to sell things that you might not want to sell. Just like our next question, or Ask Dave question. This comes from another financial advisor, Paul from North Dakota. Paul, thank you for writing in and, of course, for listening to the show. He says, as a financial advisor, I was with a big firm, but I realized there were a lot of conflicts of interest. So I joined a smaller firms, but there's still conflicts of interest there. So really, what can I do?
Well, first of all, Paul, good for you in making the jump. The big firms have some great benefits. They have deeper research. I mean, it's not an all bad thing. But you're right. If it's a big firm that's publicly traded, then, Paul, you're smart enough to know that their fiduciary responsibility isn't to their clients. It's literally to their shareholders, which means that if they have two choices to make, right, one that's really, really good for their clients and okay for the firm versus another one that's really, really good for the firm and okay for their clients, they need to pick the latter. They need to pick the one that's really good for the firm, even if it's just okay for the clients, because their fiduciary responsibility is first and foremost to the firm. So you left and you became independent. Good for you. But you might be thinking, okay, I'm with an independent firm now. Why do I still feel there's a little bias? Well, sometimes it's not just so much what you're talking about, but okay, where did the founder of your firm start if it's an independent firm? Did they start with, at one of these big firms like you did? And if so, maybe those biases continued to them and it affects how they control their firm. In my case, I can say it doesn't affect how I control my firm. I switched and became independent and started my own firm because I didn't like what I was being taught. I didn't join an independent firm per se. Maybe that's part of it. The other part of it could be because maybe they're not publicly traded, but maybe this independent firm is more worried about how much money they make. So they're trying to get you in things that are more profitable for the firm. And we all know, it's Paul, correct? Paul from North Dakota?
Paul,
yeah.
right, Paul.
Paul, we all know that over the long run, the stock market outperforms other things, right? So if they put you in all growth-oriented stuff, and not just dividend stocks, but high growth stocks, over the long run, your assets under management are going to grow and the firm's going to be able to charge a higher fee. So that could be something that's going into the mindset of the firm. I don't know. I can't answer for your firm. I don't know the owners of your firm. Maybe it's just they purely believe in this. Maybe a lot of their clients are younger and that strategy makes sense. And maybe your clients are an atypical client. I don't know. But all I can encourage you to do, Paul, is to figure out based on your clientele what's right for them and make sure you're aligned with a firm that can provide what you need to do in your heart, in your conscience for your clients.
Yep. Paul, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question and for listening to the show. If any of our listeners out there have a question that you want to ask Dave and maybe hear your question answered on a future show, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we've been doing part 2, talking about all of these important chapter topics in Dave's latest book, Retirement Income Source, same name as our radio show, of course, because income is so important, especially once you get into retirement. And, Dave, a lot of, we've had listeners write in, we've had financial advisors write in, and it really does seem like the financial advisors, at least the ones listening to our show, they have a conscience. They want to do the right thing. You mentioned reasons. Most do.
They're in the business to help people, sure.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm so proud of the people that actually wrote in, because I feel like it's it's good to hear that. It's good to see that. And, everybody has a different reason for things, Sarah. It's kind of like you talk about mutual funds or ETFs when somebody wrote in on the exchange traded funds. Well, part of it might just be, hey, I want to have work-life balance, right? Maybe I've got young children. Maybe I want to be there for every baseball game, every dance recital. So maybe I can't afford to take the time. Maybe I've got the knowledge bandwidth to do these types of things, but I don't have the time bandwidth because I need to be a dad first and an advisor second, and that's commendable. Right. It's all about balance, all about family. And I always say, I believe that, if most of these advisors knew what we're talking about today, that a lot of these advisors would find a way to solve this problem. But, if you don't realize there's an issue, if you think that the high dividend ETFs are fine, or you think being mostly equities are fine without that bond component, then, and you think there's an easier way to do something, well, you're going to do it the path of least resistance. You're going to do it the easier way. So then you could be a good dad. You can go to those dance rehearsals. You can go to those baseball games, right?
And we know this message is resonating with financial advisors out there, Dave, because we have advisors that we've that have come and talked to us. Just a couple weeks ago, we met a guy who's doing income. He's like the California David Scranton. His whole thing is about income generation, and he was able to join our team, and now he's kind of part of this family where he's found a home for what he was doing, whereas before he was kind of an outlier out there doing that income specialization.
And it's interesting because in his particular example, Sarah, he had a misguided notion for a lot of his career that, well, how do I do income? Everything's about stocks, right? So he was thinking, well, all I could do is really annuities. And then if I do securities, it's got to be all stocks. It's got to be all growth. I've got to get all the income from annuities because there's nothing else that generates income. Yeah. And he didn't realize until more recently, but thankfully before meeting us, he realized that, wait a minute, you can generate a decent amount of income from securities too. You just need to roll up your sleeves and dare to be different and do the work and not do what everyone else is doing.
Right. And being around like-minded people that can support you and can show you other ways too and new things. I think that's extremely important. So thank you so much for watching this episode of Retirement Income Source. If you like this episode, maybe you want to share it with your friends and family, you can always go listen to all of our episodes on retirementincomesourceradio.com.
And most importantly, we hope that you're here with us next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.